Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Almost as important as the question, how much damage will coronavirus do to the country's health, is the question, how much damage will it do to India's economy? And that's the key issue I shall discuss today with one of India's foremost economists, Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Jayati Ghosh. Professor Ghosh, before we discuss specific sectors of the economy that are likely to be very badly hit, let me begin by asking you, what is your overall impression of the impact coronavirus will have over the Indian economy during the next year? And let's start with the urban-based industrial and services economy.
Well, that's already hit. It's independent of the virus. The lockdown itself has already completely destroyed most of the urban informal economy and of course a lot of the formal service sector as well. So that's an immediate, much bigger stroke than demonetisation in terms of the damage it can do.
So as far as the urban industrial and services economy, you're saying two critical things. One, a lot of damage has already happened because of the lockdown. And secondly, it's much worse than demonetisation.
Yes. That's right. And remember that this is happening to an economy that was already going downhill. We were already rolling down a slope, now we're falling off the cliff.
But you're absolutely sure when you say it's already?
Already.
Just 2 days after the lockdown began, worse than demonetisation?
Oh yes, absolutely. Because this is a situation where you are doing a generalized disruption of both formal and informal activity. It's across the board, it's every sector, there's nothing that's unaffected.
So it's not just the size of the damage, but the scale across the board.
Exactly.
Let me then ask you this. If coronavirus were to significantly hit rural India, despite the fact on Sunday all trains have been stopped till the 31st of March, what would be the damage to the rural agricultural economy?
Even before coronavirus, we are seeing the damage. We are finding that farmers cannot sell large parts of the harvest that have occurred. Horticulture, they're destroying peas, they're destroying various other things.
This is because mandis have shut down?
That's right. So we are already in a situation of rural and farmer distress created by this before we actually have sickness and disease coming on this.
And if sickness and disease in the shape of coronavirus hits rural India, what then will happen to the rural economy?
It's not an if, it's when. Because we know that many migrant workers have gone in very overcrowded and unsanitary conditions back to villages. They are going to go to rural areas that have almost no health conditions, and they are going to have inevitably infect people. Now, we are dealing with a situation where already rural demand was low, where there were inadequate measures to help it revive, and you're now destroying both the supply conditions and the demand conditions.
Once again, I want to sum up because I think what you said is so important. First of all, even if coronavirus hasn't effectively, significantly hit rural India, the damage to the rural economy has begun because mandis have begun to shut down, farmers can't sell. So they will already suffer because they won't have money.
Exactly.
But then you're saying something even more significant. It's a question of time. It's not if, it's when it actually hits rural India. And at that point, it will actually cripple the entire countryside because that's where the majority of Indians live.
Yes. In fact, it's actually something, we are in uncharted territory. I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I don't think any of us can even begin to anticipate the scale of the economic shock and disaster.
One more general question. It sounds, and I know I'm interpreting, but it sounds as if you're saying that the worst-case scenario could end up becoming very close to what actually happens. The best-case scenario may be a bit too optimistic. We may be a lot closer to the worst-case scenario.
You see, the economic damage is going to be very bad even in the best case scenario, even if we are able to contain the virus. Because what we always forget, and we forgot even during demonetisation, is that once you do this kind of massive shock, it doesn't stop there. It has negative multiplier effects that continue and permeate. The Indian economy still hasn't recovered from demonetisation. Now it has to deal with this.
So even the best case scenario will be a terrible outcome.
That's right.
In economic terms.
That's right.
Let's then at this point talk about specific sectors of the economy. Let's start with the MSME sector because that I believe is pretty close to 40% of GDP and 80% of exports. Now with access to European and American markets cut off and with several orders being cancelled, what is going to happen to the MSME sector?
Well, what is already happening is, first of all, of course, a massive demand shock across the board. But think what's happening to supply chains. Everything has stopped. We're going to face serious production shortages even in essentials fairly soon, because even the production of essentials requires various other things. And when you close everything down, and factories are closing down, when transport is curtailed, you really are damaging supply chains in a way that our infrastructure cannot cope.
And the damage or the disruption of supply chains means that even any minimal hope of work, because people are willing to go and work, ends because there's nothing they've got to work on.
It's also the case, people have been saying that in India the poor will have no choice but to go out and work. There is no work.
Because there is no supply chain, there is nothing to work on.
That's right.
And this, I presume, also means that we will have a very sharp and immediate spike in unemployment. After all, pretty close to 90% of the jobs are in the unorganized sector.
Yes.
And the MSME sector is a very substantial part of the unorganized sector.
Absolutely. And we're going to get this massive spike in unemployment, not only in those who are working for some kind of company, whether formal or informal, but among the self-employed, who absolutely have no chance of livelihood at the moment.
So the so-called statistic that people have been quoting, that we had a 45-year high in unemployment in 17-18 when it rose to 6.1%, that will actually look very good in comparison to the levels we could reach of unemployment now.
We ain't seen nothing yet.
We ain't seen nothing yet.
Unfortunately.
Am I right in saying that other sectors of the economy that will be very badly hit are those that one could say are people-related? Sectors like tourism and hospitality, aviation and railways, and of course, perhaps most of all, construction, which is anyway the second biggest employer in the country. These will all be badly affected.
It's not in the future, they are. These are already badly hit. I would say these are the sectors that are facing the immediate attack and the damage. And so these are visible. We can see it happen. We can see planes closing, coming down, airlines closing perhaps. We will see all kinds of road
Trains
transport. Surface transport massively affected, the entire travel industry, the entire tourism industry, all of those we can see. What we can't see is the indirect effects they're going to have on everything else. So I do not see any sector coming out of this unscathed.
For those who aren't economists, can you give an idea of what are the sort of indirect effects that will ripple out and make the situation worse?
So let's look at it first from the demand side. All of these sectors stop. Now, basically, when you are running a taxi, you are going to do you will require various things. You will require petrol, you will require other things to assist the process, you will hire cab drivers who will then go out and demand goods and services. That's all ended. All of the people who supplied goods and services to that local travel industry.
That will stop.
Entirely. All of the people who catered to the tourism industry. Not just directly the ones who ran little hotels or provided restaurants and etc., but who provided the associated services. Nothing.
So it's not just a particular industry like tourism or travel or aviation that stops, it's all the other ancillary industries that supply to it and that perhaps depend on the products it makes at both ends will suffer and also fall.
You see, what we're seeing now is not just an attack on particular sectors. We're seeing a breaking of the linkages, of the forward and backward linkages.
So economic relationships are collapsing.
Exactly.
In that context, let me ask you this. Everyone believes that we are probably into a prolonged national lockdown, not just to the 31st of March, but probably well beyond that date. Yes. In that event, what happens to retail business? Malls have already shut down. But if small shops and kirana stores were to also be seriously affected, wouldn't that mean commerce as we know it in India would freeze?
I am actually more worried. Certainly commerce will freeze, but I think I'm even more terrified of shortages emerging because of that breakdown of supply chains. So what they have said is that essential goods and services will be maintained. But maintaining essential goods requires an ecosystem. We have broken that ecosystem. We have locked it down. We are not allowing that ecosystem. It's only a matter of time before shortages start to emerge.
And that will be made worse by the fact that when people are panic-stricken, they start bulk buying and hoarding.
That's right.
And that adds to then the problem.
Exactly. So, you could have all kinds of very, very dystopic scenarios of violence occurring, food riots occurring, all kinds of things like that. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But you cannot create this kind of lockdown for, let's say, more than a week or 2 weeks in a country like India without such severe disruptions to output.
And yet it may have to carry on well beyond the 31st if you're going to prevent the virus spreading, or at least attempt to do so.
I think there's no question that will carry on, at least till the middle of next month, right?
And so you're saying at the worst end, we could have social violence, agitation, but even if that doesn't happen, and we all hope it won't happen, there's a much bigger likelihood that simple things like soap, like tissue, like toothpastes and toothbrushes, which we all need, regardless of whether you're rich or poor, those may be difficult to buy. In some instances, shops simply may not have them.
It's already happening. You go there and you find people are bulk buying all kinds of crazy items. And I think this is, well, this is right now nervousness, but you can imagine what will happen when there are genuine shortages of these.
And let's hope this conversation, as people hear it, doesn't encourage them to go out and start doing just that bulk buying in case the shortage happens.
That will only make matters worse.
So in fact, your advice is, I'm pointing out the truth and one of the dangers that lies ahead, that there could be shortages, but please don't hear me and respond by going out and bulk buying and creating those shortages before they need to happen.
Absolutely.
Let's then come at this point to what's going to happen to manufacturing and industry. Now, they simply cannot work from home. So are they going to grind to a halt? I notice that major automobile and automobile part producers and scooter developers have actually shut their production lines down.
It's not just automobiles. Across Punjab, I'm told factories are shut. I think pretty much over the country, we're going to find factories are shut.
But Punjab actually is in an indefinite 24-hour curfew.
Yes.
So there the problem is compounded. It's not just a lockdown.
That's right. But it's a matter of time before curfews are actually extended across the country.
But the interesting thing is that this advice, work from home, it can work for some people like chartered accountants, possibly journalists. They work on a laptop, they can work from home. It cannot work for industry and manufacturing. There you have to go to the shop floor in a factory.
Absolutely. Industry, manufacturing, frankly, even the enabling services that allow people to work from home, even those, if you start attacking those, then even working from home is not going to be such a valid option in the future.
Let me then at this point come to what this means for people, because at the end of the day, that's what unemployment actually is. And we've talked about it a little, but I want to talk about it now in a much bigger, focused, concentrated way. We have no idea what size of jobs will be lost in the unorganized sector. It could be tens of millions, it could just as easily be hundreds of millions. ASSOCHAM has, however, done a survey which suggests that at least 10 million jobs will be lost in tourism. The Economic Times has done an analysis which says that 11 million jobs will be lost in retail, and perhaps 30% of jobs in the construction industry. Bear in mind, the construction industry is the second biggest employer. That 30% could be huge. Now, when you have this size of loss of jobs, it also means a loss of demand. It means people aren't buying. Will that send the economy into a vicious downward spiral?
Absolutely. That's precisely what I was saying, is that this immediate job loss in particular sectors will then translate into a generalized job loss. It need not happen if you get very proactive measures on the part of the government.
Which we'll come to in part 2.
That's right.
But if the government doesn't do it, then this vicious
as I said,
spiral.
I won't even call it a spiral. We're falling off a cliff.
Falling off a cliff. It's as dramatic as that.
It is. We have never experienced anything like what we're going through today.
You know, that phrase, falling off a cliff, is often used colloquially. I want to ask you, are you using it colloquially, or do you really mean it as a visual illustration of the dramaticness with which we'll go shoo?
I think I would use the latter sense, yes. It's a very, very serious and appallingly sharp decline.
In which case, what about daily wage workers? Now, those are people who only eat if they earn. If they don't earn, they simply don't eat. And now, because the trains are shut and there's no surface transport, they can't go back to their villages and take succor with their families. What happens to them? I take it they face a stark choice. Either they starve, or they're entirely dependent on whatever welfare the government can offer, or whatever charities, NGOs put their way.
Absolutely. We are really looking at large-scale hunger across the country in both rural and urban areas, actually. But in urban areas, the problem is magnified by the fact that there are many, many millions of migrant workers who have not been able to leave and go back to where, as you said, they would find some minimum survival. And they are stuck in cities where they will only have access to whatever they can earn. There is absolutely no earning capacity right now.
And these are people who may have a small amount of money in their pockets, which is the residual saving, and it's not going to be more than a couple of 100 rupees. When that finishes, not only are they hungry, but they're destitute as well.
That's right. So let's say a week. I mean, if in fact we could end this lockdown on the 31st of March, then, and if again economic activity somehow sort of staggers back, then there would be some possibility of survival.
But if it doesn't end on the 31st of March?
then in fact you're talking about people dying of hunger before they get COVID-19.
But then we're talking about something else as well. This once again raises the spectre, and I'm using that word spectre, of there being social unrest, violence and agitation. These are people who are hungry, they have no money left, they can't go back to their homes, they're stranded in a city, and they feel bereft, and they feel literally as if they've been thrown to the wolves.
Yes, that's why I was saying that you can imagine the most dystopic kind of scenarios.
This is where it will happen. If it does, and we
Yes,
always hope
that's
and
right.
pray it will never happen.
That's right.
But this is something the government must be very aware of.
I presume they are aware of it, but what surprises me is that they haven't taken the most basic measures that would at least try and stem this.
They haven't even in any way spoken about their concern for these people,
That's
except
right.
for Mr. Kejriwal. No one else has actually spoken about these people with sympathy and concern.
Well, I think some state governments, Kerala has done, West Bengal has talked about it. Some state
But the
governments are
central
aware.
government clearly has not.
Nobody in the central government has even recognized that this is an imminent danger.
So far, every point that we've discussed is doom, gloom and worse. But there is one aspect of the economy that will be a substantial gainer because of coronavirus, and that is because the oil price will collapse. Yesterday, the Brent oil crude was at about $25 a barrel. It's roughly at about 26, 27 today, but it's dancing around the 25, 27 per dollar barrel figure. And analysts say that this means India could have a windfall gain of somewhere between 2 and 2.5 lakh crore. To what extent will that compensate for what is also going to happen, a huge loss in revenue to the government, not just tax revenue, but non-tax revenue, and the fact that that 1 lakh crore disinvestment now looks impossible to achieve. So will this windfall gain from oil fully compensate for the loss of revenue?
It depends, because we don't really know the extent of the revenue loss, given that the government has been fudging its numbers so far. Definitely the government is a major gainer. I won't say India, I will say the government is a major gainer, because the retail price is not falling very much, so the government is pocketing the difference.
And she's just given herself the capacity to increase excise even more.
Exactly. Given the falling demand for oil, it might not be as much as they would have got in the normal circumstances. Nonetheless, it is a significant windfall for them.
You made a very important point. It is a significant windfall, but bear in mind, it's not just the price of oil that's falling, which gives a benefit to the government. Demand is falling, which means that much won't be consumed, and so the windfall gain may not be as large as it would otherwise have been.
Exactly. You can't use the earlier numbers to extrapolate to today.
One other thing, to what extent will this windfall gain be diminished, if that's the right word, by the fact that remittances into India will also go down perhaps substantially? India gets something like $79–80 billion a year. Yes. I imagine the remittance that comes from the Middle East is going to go down very sizably.
Well, yes, now that's for the balance of payments. So that would be a windfall gain for the Indian economy. This oil price thing is a windfall gain for the government. It's for the government fisc.
But I presume it will help the government spend on a whole lot of things that now need to be stepped up. So although it's a gain for the government, it could be a gain for all of us as well.
It ought to be. It ought to be a gain for the government.
And we'll discover that in part 2 when we talk about A, what the government should do, and B, whether governments in the plural are doing it. But theoretically, a gain for the government, if it's used properly, is a gain for the country.
Theoretically, yes. But it's very, very important how it's spent.
Finally, to sum up part 1, what do you believe will be the impact on GDP growth? We're a country that's obsessed with the GDP growth figure, so let me ask you that question. First of all, growth for the last quarter was just 4.7%. When you look at the year as a whole, which ends, I think, in a week's time on the 31st of March, what do you expect growth to be this year? And much more importantly, what do you think growth will be for the year that ends March 31, 2021?
So right now, I don't even believe growth is at 4.5%. It's significantly lower. I suspect currently the economy is already in recession. And on top of that, then we're getting these lockdowns and closures, which basically mean economic activity is grinding to a halt. So this quarter, at least, I would expect growth to be negative.
This quarter, which is the quarter ending 31 March, you think growth will be negative?
That's right.
In other words, it will fall from 4.7 in the last quarter by roughly 5% or more.
I don't think it was 4.5% in the last
quarter. But assuming it was.
Whatever it was, I don't think this is a growing economy. I think this is a declining economy.
So for the last quarter, which is ending March 31, 2020, you're saying growth will be negative?
Certainly this month of March will have a very, very huge negative impact.
Which means overall growth for the year ending 31 March 2020 will be way below 5%.
Oh,
it will be
yes.
even below 4 and 3%.
No question about it.
No question about it. Even perhaps below 3%.
You know, I find these numbers very hard to say because
Except the country is obsessed with them.
the country is obsessed with them, but I don't believe the 5%.
But assuming the government...
Certainly it would be at least 2 percentage points below that.
2 percentage points below 4.5, which means it could be as low as 2.5.
That's right.
What about the next year? That is to say, the year that ends March 2021.
A lot of that depends on how long this plays out for, how the government responds, what the world economy looks like. So it's very hard to say that right now. But I think for the next 6 months, we are going to see not just very, very volatile situation, but possibly economic devastation of a kind that we have not thought about.
You also said that at the moment you believe the economy is in recession.
That's right.
Now, I take it you're not using that word recession technically, because technically a
It's
recession
2 quarters.
That's right. You're talking about it metaphorically.
I'm saying it's an economy in which GDP is declining.
In other words, you're saying at the moment, our GDP is declining.
Yes.
We're into what economists call negative growth at the moment.
Yes.
How long do you see this negative growth continuing?
Well, how long will the lockdown continue? How much will we be able to contain this disease? What proactive measures will the government take to counteract it? It depends on those.
But all those measures, and we'll come to them in a big way in part 2, are not going to have an overnight effect. They're going to have a lag time before they work.
For the next 3 months, we are in very, very deep economic shit.
Are you saying for the next 3 months, the economy is going to shrink?
It's probably going to shrink, yes.
It's probably going to shrink. And to use your colorful phrase, we are in very deep shit.
Yes.
That is deeply, deeply worrying for many. Let's take this once again, Professor Ghosh, sector by sector. And let's start with business. What should government be doing to ensure businesses don't collapse?
Well, I think we should begin by looking at business, particularly from the MSME viewpoint, because as you mentioned, they are the ones who employ the bulk of Indian people, they constitute the bulk of domestic demand, and they're crucial for supply chains. So I think the focus should be on ensuring that they survive right now, and we need immediately a special package for them, a moratorium on all payments, both bank loans, GST, a bunch of other payments, immediately, because at this point they're not in a position to pay. We need immediately a package to ensure that they keep their employees. So this has been done in a bunch of other countries.
Britain, for example.
Britain, for example, where you actually do effectively a kind of payroll subsidy. You say, if you keep your workers, I will cover this much of their wages.
In Britain, Rishi Sunak, their India-born Chancellor,
right,
has actually said that the British government guarantees wages up to 80% of all salaries as a way of hoping employers won't retrench. Are you saying something similar is needed in India?
Absolutely. But it shouldn't just apply to big companies and factories.
MSMEs in particular.
Exactly.
So the first thing for MSMEs, and we're focusing at the moment on MSMEs, we'll come to big companies later.
Yes.
The first thing for MSMEs is a moratorium on all payments. Defer them, don't require them to pay their loans.
Yes.
Secondly, you're saying encourage them by giving some sort of wage support guarantee
That's
to
right.
retain their staff, not retrench them.
That's right.
Are there more measures that you think are critical for MSMEs?
Yes, because at this moment we have also destroyed the supply chains. Now remember, we are really in the middle of a war. That's the only analogy. So we are looking at a war against a virus, but it is a war that has devastated your production capacities. It has devastated demand. It is creating particular shortages. So we really need something like a kind of war room that is recognizing where the shortages can emerge, recognizing which are the systems that need to be put in place for these MSMEs to continue producing where it's required. Think of ways in which you could do that without increasing possibilities of infection.
Let me try and understand how this war room, as you call it, would tackle the disruption of the supply chain that is so critical for MSMEs. You're saying, in a sense, it would ensure that when they get information that supplies for A, B or C are stopped or held up, they're quickly cleared and brought in. In other words, it would facilitate and expedite.
That's really what China and South Korea have both done. They have actually focused on the critical things that need to be kept going, and then all the things that that production requires.
So this is not a financial measure like the moratoriums would be. This is an administrative measure to ensure that things aren't held up because supply chains have fallen or broken.
And you see, the problem when you do a generalized blockade or a generalized curfew and you say we exempt the following sectors is that you don't recognize that those sectors have backward and forward linkages.
Is there another step that you have in mind for MSMEs? Because as you say, that is so critical, it's 40% of our economy.
Well, you see, many are self-employed. And for them, there is at the moment no choice but direct income transfer. I am not a big fan of cash transfers in the general case, but right now, when there's really no employment, and until the employment revives, you really must make available some means for them to keep consuming.
So you identify MSMEs which are self-employed, which I imagine the government can do, and immediately through their Jan Dhan accounts or through Aadhaar, you make available sizable sums of money. Not one-off, I take it you're talking of monthly for a prolonged period.
Well, I would say begin with 3 months.
3 months.
Immediately. And
paid at one go or paid every month?
Paid every month, but make sure and tell them that we're going to give you this for 3 months. And essentially you can do it because you can cover a lot of MSMEs who are registered. You can cover Jan Dhan accounts. You can cover those who are registered with the MNREGA. You can cover the pensioners. You can cover a bunch of different groups, you know, those who have benefited from various anti-poverty schemes. So you know that there is a bunch of people who are going to be in distress, who have no source of employment, and you make available transfers.
Let's then come at this point to what steps the government needs to do for bigger business. I'm deliberately not using the phrase big business, but bigger business. Are there special measures there?
Well, we know that already various sectors are lobbying. The aviation industry, the airlines are already demanding a special thing, hospitality industry, etc. We already know that those who are in a position to lobby have made very specific
what
demands.
Do you think, regardless of the fact that they're lobbying and they may be very effective as lobbyists, what do you think as an economist needs to be done at this point of time to ensure big business doesn't collapse?
Big business is unlikely to collapse. It has much more staying power. Big business will not collapse if you can keep demand somehow alive.
But you can't at the moment, and you're beginning to suggest to the audience that you're not very concerned about big business.
Let me put it this way. I am concerned about them, but my fear is that the government's activities will be directed towards them. Rather than to...
And that's why we began with MSMEs and
yes.
we've gone through them pretty exhaustively. Now,
no, but agriculture.
I'll come to agriculture more. Let's do this step by step.
All right.
I'll come to agriculture.
Okay.
Let's now talk about big business. Big business is a substantial employer.
Sure.
They produce things that people want and need, from cars to automotive parts or whatever. What should be done to ensure they don't collapse?
Again, I would go sector by sector, and that's where the war room notion is so important. There are certain businesses that you really need to ensure that they stay and are viable and are continuing to produce. So you begin by ensuring that they have the conditions in which they can
Once again,
produce.
this is administrative to ensure that their supply chains are not disrupted.
It may not just be administrative. It may be that they require subsidies. It may be that they require a tax holiday. It depends.
What about the government itself deciding, without going through the war room process that you're suggesting, that in fact they will give tax relief, that they will reduce tax rates, or that they will postpone, more importantly, tax payment to a later date, and secondly, that they will give softer, easier, perhaps even interest-free loans. Both of these are measures that have been done extensively in Western Europe and America. Do you not think it would be wise for the government to do it for big business in India as well?
Well, certainly a moratorium on tax payments for sure.
A moratorium?
I mean, for the time being. That is to say, delaying the tax payments.
For 6 months or 7
yeah,
months?
some, we have to see how long, but begin with 3 months and possibly extend if required right now. But in addition to that, I would say it has to be sector specific. To give a very large bailout to, let's say, airlines would be, in my mind, less effective for the economy than the same amount of money going to ensure, for example, that you don't get food riots by massively expanding public distribution.
Okay, I understand the trade-off you're making, but are you saying that in fact there shouldn't be large subsidies for big business, or are you saying sector by sector only?
I would say sector by sector, not one big size thing for all large corporates.
But you're suggesting tax moratoriums across the board.
Yes.
Don't you think you should then also consider cheaper loans, maybe even interest-free loans across the board?
Yes, but focus them on MSMEs.
I'm not saying exclude MSMEs, but I'm saying in addition. Why are you making it an either or?
Because
in addition to what you do for MSMEs?
At the moment, MSMEs get less than 10% of the credit. So anything that you're doing,
But
a
you're
broad
suggesting
brush,
to me or to the audience that if you do something for big business, it's going to be at the cost of MSMEs. Is it not possible to do everything MSMEs require and also do things that big business require? That it's not an either or, you
no,
can do
it's
both.
not an either or, but there are fiscal costs. We cannot get away from those.
And the priority should be MSMEs.
The priority should be MSMEs.
Let's come to salaried people. A lot of them are people actually watching this program. Do you think the government should defer mortgage and EMI payments for them?
Ideally, yes. And in fact, some state governments actually suggested a moratorium on all kinds of payments, tax payments, interest payments, EMIs, everything.
So in addition to big business getting a moratorium on their tax payments, which are basically corporate tax and I presume GST, you're also suggesting income tax deferrals for people like you and me who pay income tax.
Well, you know, income tax deferrals is, I would say again, less priority, lower down. Because frankly, the proportion of people who pay income tax is very, very small, and we're getting salaries.
But then what do you mean by tax moratorium?
Moratorium for the corporate tax people, right?
For the corporate tax. But EMI deferral and mortgage deferral
EMIs, yes.
For salaried
yes.
people.
Which in turn implies that you have to do something to allow the banks to live with this.
Well, what about banks? If companies are unable to pay their loans, and several now will be, if EMI is deferred, and worse still, if something that people feared before coronavirus now happens, that many mudra loans turn into defaults in a sizable way, and that was being worried about last month, surely banks will also need special assistance.
Oh, recapitalize, there's no question. You'll have to do that. You'll have to recapitalize in a big way.
And you're talking about hundreds and thousands of lakhs.
Yes.
And this the government has to be ready to do.
You have to keep this economy afloat.
Let's then at this point come to agriculture and rural India. First of all, what are the steps the government needs to do to ensure that farmers have income and that their demand doesn't collapse and that they have markets to sell to?
So first of all, even the measures that we're taking right now, they're quite draconian and they're absolute, right? You stop, you declare a curfew, you do not allow a mandi to open, you cannot allow, farmers cannot sell their products. We're about to get to the end of the Rabi harvest. So we really need to be much more sensitive and nuanced about how we impose these measures. So again, I go back to the war room.
I'm interrupted, but the fact that we're getting very close to the Rabi harvest means that in fact, if you don't allow mandis to function, farmers will be sitting on a crop. Some people said that in fact it could be quite a bumper harvest this year, but unable to sell it.
That's right, exactly. And the fear is that some crops like peas and so on already are actually being thrown by farmers.
So the first thing you're saying is ensure mandis function, even if they function in a rudimentary way, so that farmers sitting on their Rabi crop can sell it.
Ensure minimum support price, very, very important, again, because right now markets are, even if the mandis function, there are no buyers.
The government of course regularly does announce minimum support prices. Are you saying you need to announce specially enhanced ones now?
I'm saying they need to make sure those minimum support prices are the minimum. At the moment, in fact, because the procurement operations are so sparse, so infrequent, so delayed, most farmers end up selling well below the MSP.
So this time they must be implementable and effective.
That's right.
What else is needed for agriculture and farmers?
Well, again, immediately a moratorium on crop loans. Because if you cannot sell, you obviously can't repay.
The problem is the vast majority of farmers, I believe, actually don't take their loans from central or government-owned banks. They take them from loan sharks.
That's right.
How do you put a moratorium there?
Well, again, the point is if you announce one, let's say from the cooperative credit societies and etc. in a generalized way, it gives farmers slightly more bargaining power, and usually the input dealers, the local money lenders are slightly more sensitive to the conditions and will allow a deal.
But they're hoping here that human nature will make them more sensitive because they see that their farmers are in plight. It often doesn't work.
No, it's not just human nature, it's also the sheer economic necessity. When you know that there is a generalized incapacity to pay.
The loan shark will say to himself, I have to be lenient and considerate because otherwise he'll never be able to pay me back and I'll lose.
That's number one. And number two, eventually it could well be that you would have to recapitalize the money lenders.
Do you think that the government should consider something they haven't considered before, which is to say to farmers, all of you who are in debt to loan sharks, we will give you fresh loans so that we can stand by you and you can no longer be indebted to them. Pay off those, we'll give you fresh loans.
This government doesn't have the capacity to do this right now. We are talking about things that have to be done within the next few weeks. They don't have the capacity, nor do state governments have the.
Is there anything else that is needed further beyond facilitating mandis, implementing effectively the MSP, and
raising the
moratoriums on
MSP.
crop loans? Anything else?
Moratorium on all payments to be made by farmers.
All payments across the board.
That's right, exactly. And ensuring that they can sell their produce. It's not just allowing mandis to function, but you have to be out there to be the buyer, because in fact, they don't have incomes now. Rural population will not have incomes.
Let's then at this point come to what the government should do for the vulnerable. And I'm talking not just urban vulnerable, but rural vulnerable, India's vulnerable. And here there have been several suggestions that have been canvassed. Some people are talking about doubling PM Kisan. Some are talking about doubling pensions. Others are talking about hugely extending availability of rations, both in terms of the price as well as in terms of the quantity. Others are talking about increasing NREGA work days. There's even, as you mentioned, talk about giving something like 12 crore people. I think Praveen Chakravarti of the Congress party wrote about it in the Hindu yesterday. 12 crore people, an immediate cash grant through Jan Dhan. Do all of these make sense?
Yes, all of them make sense. I would say the number one thing is the food rations. Double, triple the food rations, make them available free for 1 month. We are sitting on huge amounts of excess food stocks. We are paying money. The Food Corporation of Money is paying money to hold on to these stocks. Release them to state governments, who are, by the way, begging for it.
Arvind Kejriwal has announced 2 days ago a 50% increase in food rations to something like 8 million people. That, you're saying, is a very sensible measure.
I think even more sensible is what the Kerala government has done, free food rations for a month. 10 kilos for everybody and more for the vulnerable households.
What about Arvind Kejriwal's decision that anyone who comes to night shelters will be given 2 free meals a day?
Janta kitchens is absolutely essential at this point. Think of all the migrant workers who are stuck in cities. Think of all the people who are otherwise destitute because they had normal little tiny occupations that they cannot actually pursue anymore. So you must have these Janta kitchens.
The UP government has picked up on the idea of cash advances through Jan Dhan accounts. They've decided to give 1,000 rupees a month to 35 lakh daily wage workers. Again, this is very much in line with your thinking.
Yes, I would say it has to be much more. 5,000, let's say.
5,000.
Yes, at least to every Jan Dhan account, probably 10,000. But it's a start. Yes, definitely.
Now, so far we've talked about what the government needs to do in terms of business, in terms of MSME, in terms of agriculture and farmers, and of course in terms of the vulnerable. But this is of course a health crisis. And India has a woefully inadequate health system. And yet we're facing by far the biggest challenge the Indian healthcare system has ever faced. In fact, this is more than anyone could have ever imagined, and therefore no one would even have catered for this.
That's right.
Had we been well funded.
Yes.
But the truth is we're very poorly funded. So now, what is it that the government can or should do to try and give us even a fighting chance to survive?
What the government must do, number one, is to increase the wages and improve the working conditions of our frontline health workers.
That's doctors and nurses.
Doctors, nurses, ANMs, Ashas, Anganwadi workers, these are the frontline workers. These are the ones who are in contact with people. These are the ones who are facing the most
So
threat.
immediately double their salaries.
Double the salaries of the most vulnerable, not necessarily all doctors and nurses, but give them the proper facilities with which to work.
But that's the second question. How do you do it? I mean, are you saying that they should start converting empty hotels which now aren't being used into force majeure hospitals? Because all hotels are empty. Is that something
Certainly,
they should
that
do?
is one of the things that we could do, and we probably will have to do once the numbers increase beyond a point. No, but I'm talking about even more basic things. Give them gloves, give them masks, give them the basics that they need, give them sanitizer. Many of our frontline workers do not have any of these things.
Should we be doing what Britain in wartime did, which is to give an order, executive order to industry, convert now to producing the following,
Yes.
and set a target and insist they do it by this date? And so say to people, it's not cars we need any longer, it's not bicycles, you will convert to this, which is what in wartime Britain did.
Yes.
And America has the power to do it, but it seems Trump's not using it. But you're saying Mr. Modi should do this, and if he hasn't got the power, give himself the power.
So 2 things we should be producing many hundreds of multiples of is testing kits and ventilators. We are completely inadequate in both of these. At the moment, only one Gujarati-based crony firm is allowed to produce testing kits.
Well, no, I think the government has given permission, according to Mr. Bhargav, to 2 more Indian manufacturers of testing kits to begin. It may take them time, but permission has been given.
But then it's private testing. Testing must be free. It's private testing up to a limit of 4,500 per test. That's obscene. Testing must be free. It's a public health issue. It's not that person who is affected. It is everybody else who is affected.
But as you say, the government must immediately ensure that we have enough ventilators, hospital beds, testing kits. NDTV revealed, I believe yesterday or day before, that there is an Indian gentleman who's in a position to produce 20,000 ventilators a month. We have a total of 40,000 in the country. This man says on television he can produce 20,000 a month. But the clearances are not coming. And more importantly, the items that he needs to bring in, like chips and things, are stuck at ports and not being cleared.
So this is what I mean about the war room. Now you see the significance of the war room. You have to have a situation where you are looking at the ecosystem required to produce the things you need most of all.
So you're saying, as far as health is concerned, not only is this a question of putting as much money as you can into people's pockets to incentivize them to work more, also think creatively about converting empty hotels into hospitals, and focus on immediately producing ventilators, testing kits, gloves and other protective gear. Clearly, we can't import anything because the world is not going to be selling medicine to us at this point in time.
And we didn't stockpile when we needed to, so we have to begin, but we can do it still if we do it with enough urgency. But I just want one more point about the preventive. We are giving out these rules: stay in your homes, preserve social distancing, wash your hands frequently. In our slums, there are people living 10 to a room. They have no water. They get maybe 2 buckets of water a day. How are we talking about implementing these rules there? We should be making available water and soap. We should be providing them the conditions under which they can actually ensure social distancing.
In fact, you're saying that one of the best measures the government can take in terms of ensuring health is to make available water, make available soap, so that people who live in slums, who can't possibly social distance because they often live 5 to 6 per room, at least have soap to wash their hands. At least they have the basic rudimentary sanitary facilities they need.
Exactly. And this is something, again, Kerala has been doing.
Now, all of this is going to cost a fortune. I'm combining everything you've talked about in part 2 so far, whether it's moratoriums for MSMEs, whether it's guaranteed bank loans.
Well, a moratorium is a delayed payment.
But it means revenue not coming in.
Right now, but
Absolutely.
it will come in. It will come in
later.
later.
Well, you hope. Because if businesses don't pick up, that revenue could be foregone, not just delayed. But at the moment, we're talking of a government that needs to make massive expenditure at a time when revenue, tax in particular, but even disinvestment and non-tax revenue, is going to shrink hugely. So how does the government pay for all of this?
Look, it's war. You don't think about fiscal deficits in a time like this. No country in the world is thinking about this. The IMF has said stop thinking about this. Angela Merkel in Germany is saying we're not going to think about this. We will do whatever it takes.
In fact, the British Chancellor has given a guarantee we will spend whatever it takes. Exactly. There is no limit.
Exactly. This is the moment. If not now, then when?
So you're saying Mr. Modi and Nirmala Sitharaman's attitude should be, we will spend whatever it takes. There is no limit.
Exactly.
Literally,
yes.
The sky is the limit.
The sky is the limit, but also remember, do not spend on non-priority items. Forget about this Central Vista thing. If you have to do it next year. You shouldn't do it, but don't do it now.
Prioritize your spending.
Exactly.
And hopefully the government will. But once you prioritized it, once you've got the right targets in mind,
just spend it.
So in other words, the fiscal deficit, which is meant to be either 3.3 or 3.5, could rise even to 6 or 7.
Yes. And I'm saying it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. This is not a year when the fiscal deficit is of any importance whatsoever.
Exactly.
So you're happy as an economist to let it go to 6, 7?
Frankly, that depends on the denominator. If you spend less, your denominator is going to fall so much that you will go to 6 or 7 anyway.
Let's then, at this point, when you fully explained in considerable detail what it is that governments should do, let me ask you, to what extent are governments actually doing what's required of them? And let's start with the central government. Is it living up to what you believe is required of it?
Not at all. In fact, the inaction on the part of the central government has been a source of terror for me, because we cannot afford inaction at this point. We should have started at least 2 months ago, but let's say we should have started mid-February. Several calls were made by opposition leaders even then, saying take this seriously, prepare yourself. Nothing happened. Okay, we haven't really done anything, so we've lost valuable time. Now, the central government is not just not putting it out there saying we will actually do a package. They're saying we're thinking about it, we're working on it. It's too late, it's too long. You're declaring lockdown. People have already lost livelihood for a week. People are already in distress. Migrants are either stuck midway or stuck in cities with nowhere to go, nothing to do, nothing to eat. You have to do something immediately. Nothing so far. I think that's one major source of concern.
Can I interrupt at that point? Governments abroad have already introduced major economic recovery packages.
That's right.
Right? We're talking of $1 trillion in the case, if not more, in America. There's even some talk that the second phase could go up to $2 trillion in America. Britain has gone up to several hundreds of billions. The French and the Germans have gone beyond 500 and 600 billion.
That's right.
There is no economic package. Leave aside a figure, there is no economic package announced by the central government.
Not at all. And instead we're getting tiny little things on the side, you know, this form can be submitted a bit later and that particular
Well, today
thing.
as we talk, the finance minister has announced certain compliance and statutory regulations being delayed. So in other words, you can delay filing your tax and the amount of interest you'd have to pay has come down roughly from 12 to 9 or whatever. Therefore, statutory compliance matters are being tackled today. But this big question of what do you do to hold the economy together is still deferred. She was asked today at a press conference, she says, we're working on it, it will be announced soon. And the best assurance she gave was sooner rather than later. But that could be tomorrow, day after, or whenever.
I think that's appalling. Because in fact, there's no time to lose. It should have started well before. Some state governments have started. I just want to say it's not just acts of omission on the part of the central government. There's a major act of commission. They are preventing state governments from taking
I'll come to
very
state governments in a moment's
measures.
time, but are you saying this attitude that the government reflects, they haven't said it, but it seems to be underlying that attitude, that time is on our side, we can take 2 days more, it's okay. You're saying that is the wrong attitude.
Absolutely. We are already in this economic catastrophe. We're about to fall over the cliff.
Let's then come to state governments. A whole variety of state governments have announced a whole variety of measures. I won't go into the list of state governments because it stretches beyond 10, 12 and 15. But they've done things like doubling pensions, hugely increasing rations, giving cash handouts immediately to large numbers, 25, 35, 40 lakh people at one go. How do you estimate and analyze what state governments have done?
I think several state governments have taken very good measures already, and of course they will need to do more. But the problem is, overall, they just have no money. There's a real problem of liquidity with state
And
governments.
after GST, they can't raise money themselves either.
They cannot raise money themselves. The central government has been very niggardly in passing on even what they are owed. So they're actually legally sort of at fault by not giving the state governments what they need. And state governments have a hard budget constraint. They
State
can't
budgets can't increase their fiscal deficit of their own without central government permission either.
Number one, they can't do that. But number two, if they don't have cash balances, they actually really can't spend.
You was a moment ago suggesting that in fact even some state governments who want to do things are being stopped by the central government. Give me an example of that.
So, for example, the state of Kerala declared a moratorium of the kind that I have just mentioned on all payments, GST, interest payments, everything. The centre took them to court, to the Supreme Court of India.
And the Supreme Court overturned it.
Yes.
So this was a decision initiated by the central government, but unfortunately it actually got the Supreme Court's imprimatur on it.
Exactly. And that is so shocking because it actually is denying a state government the capacity to enable its citizens to survive what is in fact a catastrophic kind of situation.
But coming to the end of this interview, you give me the impression that you think state governments, to the extent they can, are doing what they can, but they don't have the funds, they can't raise fresh funds, and often they are being stopped, as you gave an example of Kerala, by the centre or the courts. It's the central government's failure to respond, not just inadequately, but to respond at all, that has you deeply concerned.
It's terrifying to me because, you know, so much has to be done and it has to be done very quickly. I think they haven't realized the extent or the enormity of what faces us. And I think they can continue to wing it, you know, have people sing Antakshari, bang pots and so on as a way to ward off this disaster.
So are you saying, because this is what it sounds like, that at a moment of crisis, the central government, and I'll be honest, Mr. Modi in particular, are letting us down?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You have no doubt about it.
No.
Professor Ghosh, a pleasure talking to you, but no, we won't shake hands.
Oh, yes.
We should instead be good and say namaste. And by the way, I need to apologize for the fact that frequently my hand went to my mouth. I know it shouldn't, but that's a bad habit and I'm trying to control it.